Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi everyone. Today is going to be a little different because I've asked the owners of two different native plant nurseries here in Kentucky to be my guests in kind of a roundtable type discussion. But even though we're all located in Kentucky, our conversation is going to be applicable for those of you in other states as well. Also, in addition to guiding the conversation, I'll be participating in the roundtable discussion as a representative of my own small-scale nursery. So our guests today are Alicia Bosela from Ironweed Native Plant Nursery and Margaret Shea from Dropseed Native Plant Nursery. Hi, Alicia and Margaret. Welcome to Backyard Ecology, and thank you for talking with us today.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, likewise.
So the reason I wanted to have this conversation today is because I thought we could help our listeners learn a little bit more about growing native plants, because that's something that so many people are interested in right now. Let's start out, though, by telling everyone just a little bit about who each of us are, what our backgrounds are, and our nurseries and why we started them.
So I'm Margaret Shea, and for most of my career, I worked in nonprofits working on natural areas management. I worked at Bernheim Forest and for the Nature Conservancy, and I really saw a need for local plants to be available, native plants to be available to purchase. When I was buying plants for restoration projects, I had to go to Michigan and Missouri for them at that time. And I always wanted my own business. So 16 years ago, I bit the bullet and started Dropseed Native Plant Nursery. And actually, I started it with restoration projects in mind, thinking that I would help with wetland restorations and provide plants for prairie restorations. But I was really happy and surprised to find how many homeowners just want to buy native plants for their home landscape. So that's really more than half of our business now. And we're located just east of Louisville, Kentucky.
Awesome. Alicia?
Hi, Ironweed Native Plant Nursery is in South Central Kentucky. It's in Columbia. It's about 20 miles south of Campbellsville. And I came to do it by way of a whole assortment of different jobs. Originally, I was teaching a couple intro biology classes for non-majors, which was really fun. I was terrible at biology and I made every mistake, so I knew exactly what they needed. Instruct them better because I'd made all the mistakes first. So that was fun. And after that, I did some environmental education for all ages and workshops and things like that, which was really very good learning experience. So I came at it that way. That was kind of a faraway job. So I ended up coming down, being at home with the kids a little more was very nice. It was something I could do here. And it was really wonderful because being kind of remote, it kind of forces you to go to lots of different places where there's opportunity. So driving around the state was hard, but there's so many lovely people and it was very enjoyable to try to, connect up with different groups.
Okay. And then this is Shannon again. Just make sure everybody can tell our different voices apart from each other. But yeah, my training is in wildlife biology. And I've always loved teaching and sharing about nature and scientific research, especially outside of the formal classroom. I have a lot of respect for teachers in the formal classroom. That's not me. I do much better outside and in that more informal, non-formal education world. But I actually first thought about starting a native plant nursery probably almost 20 years ago. But at the time, I was living out in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't sure how to do it. I wasn't sure if anybody would be interested in it at the time. So I never really did anything with that idea. I was just like, oh yeah, that might be nice, but wrong location, wrong time. I'm not the right person type thing. And then several years ago, my husband and I bought our farm. And I knew immediately that one of the things I wanted to do was grow more plants that I could put out for pollinator and wildlife habitat, because with both of us being wildlife biologists, providing that habitat was important to us on our farm. As I started doing that, some of my friends started finding out and they wanted plants and some of their friends did. And all of a sudden, this crazy idea that I'd had years and years and years before suddenly seemed possible with a native plant nursery. So I started in 2016, Busy Bee Nursery and Consulting. and I specialize in plants for pollinators and wildlife. So one slight difference between my nursery and Alicia and Margaret is that very rarely I might have one or two species that are not native. And that's because there are non-natives that are good for pollinators and wildlife and don't cause any problems. Usually for me, I produce too many herbs for my own garden. And so here's some extra herbs until they sell out. But yeah, I leave that open as a possibility. But for the past 3 years, everything I've had has been native, which kind of brings me to something that I wanted to ask you guys about. And knowing you all, knowing your nurseries and your work, I have an idea of where you're going to go with this, but I think it's a discussion that we need to have very early on to help our listeners understand what we're talking about. So both of you have native plants as part of your nursery name. But we live in a world today where anybody can get on the website and find you on the internet from anywhere in the world. I know for a fact we have listeners who are not from the state of Kentucky right now, who are listening to us from all kinds of other states. And this episode will be available for years in the future. So who knows who's going to hear it and from where. So what does native mean to you? When you talk about native plants, what exactly are you talking about? Because we all have different plants native to different areas.
I guess I'll jump in. This is Margaret. I think that is a tough question, and there's always disagreement, I guess, or discussion about that. I think it's important when you're talking about natives to say native to where. Mm-hmm. I think you have to say the region, because you can talk very generally about natives, talk about natives of North America. But I think it's more meaningful when you narrow that down and talk about a smaller region, central Kentucky or, the Kentucky, southern Indiana, Tennessee sort of area. I think that makes more sense. And I define a native as something that was here prior to European settlement. And, there were disturbances to our native plants prior to that, but that really is the time when human impact really increased dramatically and plants were brought in from many different areas. So that's how I define it. And I do get orders. What I do is I do ship to adjacent states, and I don't kind of police, where my plants will go. But I do originally collect from areas in Kentucky because I think that local genetics is important. And so I do really emphasize keeping the native plants in a reasonable radius of where they came from, where they're native.
I guess I'll jump in. This is Alicia. Yeah, I often get this question comes up, and I kind of try to tell people, well, it's all the plants that were here before Daniel Boone got here. They usually get it that way, wildflowers and things like that. And I think it is a tough question because even within the state of Kentucky, there are books that tell you what was here. And sometimes you'll see the USDA plants database will give you a distribution of all these different kinds of plants. And sometimes you'll see a plant that's native and it's in every single state all around Kentucky except our state. And you got to wonder if it was here. And although there were some very, I'm talking very early on 1800s and things like that, early botanists, there were some, but I mean, I'd be interested in hearing what you all have to say about this. There were some very good ones, but I do believe there might have been more here than they were able to document simply because there weren't that many botanists. I mean, there were some, they were very good, but maybe there weren't a lot. So for example, C.W. Short was in Hopkinsville, and I was reading about him, and he has the only documented case of this particular obedient plant. It's Intermedia. And if he hadn't collected it, no one would have known it was in the entire state. So there's that, should those be included too? And then there's a whole thing about genetic diversity, which you touched on a little bit, Margaret. What I try to do is also collect locally if at all possible, but then sometimes I'll be collecting plants that are like in islands, they're just really surrounded by a parking lot, and you wonder about the genetic diversity there. So you try to get them from different populations to cross and keep them healthy. And they may not be from exactly the same region in Kentucky, but the genetics is important. And then you get the whole question, which is a little bit of a can of worms about nativars, and everybody has a different opinion about it. But if you're someone who's kind of hardcore about genetic diversity, nativars are tough for me. And sometimes I would just raise the question whether that's kind of greenwashing. Like, I think they're presented as kind of a compromise between natives and non-natives, and that they're good, but just that they're genetic clones, and that people may not realize if you're trying to help out with native plants, I'm not sure that's a big help, because the genetic diversity is going to be more and more and more important as climate changes and populations shrink. And I kind of am concerned about the misrepresentation a little bit, or maybe the lack of communication, that whether these are truly helpful. And so I'd raise that question to you guys, because it's hard to answer.
Well, I'll say and this is Shannon again, with the nativars, I think it really depends on what you're looking at. I don't think there's one answer or one perfect answer with it. So if you're changing leaf color or petal color, that relates back to the chemicals in the plant. So then it becomes a question of, can the caterpillars eat it as well and digest it as well as they could the straight type species? It comes into questions of, if you're changing the petal colors, is that going to make it more or less visible to bees and the butterflies that see things differently than we do? What's that doing to the nectar supply? Because genes are linked, and sometimes in ways that we don't expect it. So I really think, coming from a pollinator perspective and an ecological perspective, in the small garden areas, that it depends. If you're looking at whether the pollinators, the other animals and stuff, will use it as much, if that's your question, then it's something that has to really be looked at on a case-by-case basis. It's going to change every time, which isn't really practical, really, to look at. I mean, some research has been done on some species, and that's important. And so then we know in this cultivar, yes, for this particular species of animal, it seems to be just as good or not as good. There's been a few studies that have looked at it from a more general perspective. So we've got guidelines and ideas, but there's a lot of complications in there. There's no one set answer. And then you bring it into the conservation arena. So looking at the genetic diversity, like you're talking about, Alicia, and if you're planting enough of these cultivars close enough to the wild populations that you're going to get mixing of the gene pools, that brings up a whole nother question. So I think it kind of comes down to what you're asking about and where you're looking at planting these things and what you're changing with them. I mean, it's complicated. There is no simple answer, in my opinion. Straight species are the safe bet, but sometimes you can't always go with safe.
Well, I'll jump in too. This is Margaret. And I mean, I'm not a big fan of nativars, I have to say, but I understand that some people want that predictability. And you don't get that from the straight native species, because they're germinated from seed, and there's a lot more genetic diversity. So there'll be variable heights and variable petal colors. And, if someone has to have that regularity in their garden, then that is their choice, obviously. But I do think, like Alicia said, you're losing something. You're losing that diversity that also helps get through a rough winter, or certain plants that might be able to withstand attack by an insect better. And so if you want a healthier population of plants, I do think that straight native is the way to go. And if you want to feed wildlife, then I think the straight native is the safer choice, the better choice for them.
Yeah, this is Shannon again. I completely agree with you there, Margaret. I mean, I'm the same way. I plant straights, I grow straight species. That's what I work with, but I can't villainize the cultivars and the nativars either. So I'm kind of in that, okay, this is what I choose, but okay, I can see the points on some of the other stuff. So I have a balance in there.
Yeah. And how do you all communicate that when it comes up? How do you all handle when maybe someone wants you to contract grow with nativars, or somebody's asking you questions about, little Joe Pieweed? How do you all you have to finesse your answers and try to be respectful. I'm just curious how you all handle that.
This is Margaret, and what I say often is that because I grow both for restoration projects and home landscapes, it's really important for me to keep the genetic diversity high, so that the native species will be better adapted when they're going out into wild areas. Mm-hmm. And so it makes it easier for me just to do that only and not do cultivars. So I feel like that kind of gets that message across.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been asked to grow cultivars for a contract grow project, or do you do it? Or if you were asked, would you do it?
I've never been asked about it, but I'm also working on a smaller scale than I know both of you guys are as well. Yeah, that doesn't really come up usually with me, but Margaret?
Yeah, this is Margaret. I have been asked, little blue stem is something that I love that plant, but it is so variable. And you really do get different, heights and colors, and there are a ton of cultivars for that. And I have been asked to grow a cultivar of that, but chose not to.
For that reason?
Yeah, for that reason, because I'm doing native plant growing for my own passionate reason about conservation. And I don't object to non-natives or cultivars, on a general scale, but this is why I am doing it. And so I need to do how it makes sense for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that kind of brings up something else that I wanted to touch on with you guys and ask questions, because I know native plants have really exploded in popularity within the last several years. And so has pollinator gardening. And I know I'm coming at this from a wildlife biology background. So I'm kind of looking at the animals first, and then the plants. The plants are providing the food. The plants are providing the cover. The plants are providing the habitat basis. If I remember correctly with both of you guys' backgrounds, both of you all are coming at it more from the botany background, correct?
This is Margaret. I actually have a background in ecology.
Okay.
But more plant oriented, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I come at it, originally I kind of described myself as a field botanist, so I was super lucky to work for the Forest Service and just taxonomy and identifying all the plants in the woods. So I've got that. I think of myself as an ecologist, which is what I got in school, and then environmental education. So dabbled in all of them, but mostly plant oriented too. And I try to think, like you were saying, if you're talking about an individual plant, not just, what its value is to the pollinator, but if it's going to survive a harsh winter and things like that. So I think sometimes when I interact with people, it's really wonderful that they're interested in how it affects wildlife and things like that. It's critical and wonderful, but it's also important to tie in how climate is changing. So it's not just the pollinators and the nectar we're worried about, but also like Margaret said, the genetic diversity and how it's going to be important to keep that high, and just all these other factors. And there are so many factors. Some are, some little blue stem may be good in droughty areas, and some are, good in other areas. So just trying to keep that perspective and remind people, which they love to hear about all that anyway. So
each of us are kind of coming at this from similar but also slightly different angles and perspectives. So I was kind of curious, what are you seeing your customers coming at it from? Are they coming at it more from the perspective of native plants? Let's plant native plants, or let's have a pollinator garden, or let's do wildlife conservation, and the native plants are a way to achieve this? Or is there any difference between your customers?
I guess I'll jump in. This is Margaret. I think it's really fun that my customers come from all different perspectives. And I love that. And it's so interesting to see the different ways they come to it and try to use that as a way to encourage more people to grow native plants. So I think there's been a big interest in edibles. So, native edibles has been really fun. And I like to steer people towards those when they want to eat a pawpaw or persimmon or chokeberry. And pollinators has been huge. I mean, it's just amazing how, especially the monarch butterfly, but also bees and other butterflies, that's really drawn in a lot of people. And I love to use that to show them, there are a lot of other species that are having trouble, and the plants themselves are declining. But then also, a lot of my customers are doing more restoration projects and are really looking at the big picture, looking at restoring those plant communities so that the ecological processes can return, as well as all the wildlife. So I think it's really exciting that they're coming in from all different directions like that. It gives us a bigger base.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, it is really rewarding when they come at it at all different angles, and to see the amount of interest and enthusiasm that they bring. Yeah, I've seen a lot of interest also in pollinator gardens. That'd be probably the number one thing I see. And the number one question, I guess, within that would be, what plant do I put where? And, how do I do this? Which is wonderful because it's fun. And I haven't had much interest myself in the native edibles, but a little permaculture, a little bit of herbal medicinal, which I don't have any experience with. I can kind of point them to some plants. So that's really fun. A lot of people almost like homesteading a little bit they're trying to kind of do their own thing and be a little more self-sufficient, which is a lot of fun. And the restoration, I think, is just fantastic. I think there's some grants sometimes here and there for people who are restoring along streams. And it's just fantastic when that happens, because my number one favorite thing is that when they restore their little patch, then there's a seed source for everywhere else downstream. And it's just wonderful that they take an interest in that there's some, help financially with doing that. But just those simple things. And some people are just interested. They'll come in and they'll say, what do you have that's new and weird? And that's a lot of fun to talk about. Or somebody will come in and they'll say, just tell me, I'm interested in anything that'll be a host plant. And I'm like, well, that's everything. So that's fun, and just keep branching out. And a lot of people also are interested in hummingbirds, and that's really fun. There's some festivals, a couple maybe in the state, that people are interested in looking at. And it's fun how they start there and then they kind of branch out farther and farther. I don't know if Margaret or Shannon, you've had this conversation, but someone will come in and will say, what is that sedge? It'll be gray sedge. And so it's super cool to look at. And then suddenly they're pointing out all the sedges and say, I never thought I'd be interested in sedges, but once you get in, you realize it's fabulous. So I don't know if you all have had that experience.
Well, experiences on a different front, where it's like, oh, I want something that'll attract butterflies. Well, like you said, that's a lot. And then are you talking the adults or are you talking the babies? Because we've got to have baby food if we want the adults. So doing that, and then starting to talk about how it all branches out together and how it interconnects, and this attracts this, but it also attracts this, and then this other thing happens with it.
Yeah, I think the main thing I see that just really makes everything worthwhile is how almost always people are enthusiastic and interested and supportive. And I just think to myself, who else is lucky enough to have a job where someone is just supportive and happy? And it's just wonderful.
I think that a lot, Alicia. I have other friends that work in retail, and they're like, oh, retail, it's terrible. Gosh, I have, such a different experience because we've selected this group of people that's passionate about the same thing. And it really is just a wonderful to have that kind of energy surrounding you.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I've been lucky to get a group of people around me too that are just as supportive and just as wonderful. And so, yeah, it helps a lot. And it's always great when you can love what you do like we do.
Yeah.
Now, there is something I wanted to touch on that both of you guys brought up. You mentioned collecting. So I want to bring that up. I know how you guys collect, but there's a lot of different opinions and talk within, especially native plant communities, about collecting and wild collecting of plants. So let's have that conversation for anybody that's listening that might be, oh, I want to get into native plants. They talked about collecting. Can I go out and dig up that plant that I just saw? Let's say that beautiful orange milkweed by the side of the road. I think we need to have that conversation. And so how do you collect?
Well, Shannon, this is Margaret, and I collect seed.
Yes.
And even when I'm collecting seed, I try to do that as responsibly as possible. You don't want to get seed just from one individual plant, obviously. You want to get from a variety of plants to get that genetic diversity. But you also don't want to collect all the seed from that spot so that you don't have either food for birds or new seeds for reproduction. So I definitely do not dig from the wild. I do think that taking something from a beautiful spot and potentially having an invasive exotic come in there instead. So those kind of disturbances. The other problem is those plants often don't survive that disturbance as well. So I do feel strongly you should just collect seed with permission, from land.
Yeah, I fully agree. I've heard a lot of people kind of comment to themselves and to their, someone coming with them, along with them, we should go over to such and such a place I saw along the road, and there's a whole bunch of, swamp milkweed, and dig some up. And I kind of discourage it as gently as possible and, talk about where else they can get it for, a reasonable price and have more luck with it surviving. And it's a really tough thing, I think, sometimes when there's situations where an area, so I have a friend in Madisonville, and he'll find areas and he knows they're going to spray them. So he's had to contact the people and ask them not to spray. And I'm talking about Turk's cap lily and all these rare, wonderful, natural heritage treasures. And so he, bent over backwards and asked the people not to spray them. He'll mark them. And then really, the salvaging, but that should be left up to very, very specific ask permission and so forth. Those are not the typical way things come up. But yeah, I totally encourage people to get seed from multiple plants. And I also try to get seed from as many plants as possible and not take any little starts, although I might take a little start here and there of something that's growing in a crack along the asphalt of a road that's going to be sprayed, and we know it's going to be sprayed and we have permission. So, but I wouldn't encourage anybody else to do that, because it takes a long time to know all the people that you need to get permission from and so forth. So rarely, I try not to do that. Yeah, I did really discourage people from just going out and digging things up. But, seed is definitely something, get a little bit of seed to start is great. And read up about how to raise the seed. I get a lot of people who are unsure about, like with vegetables, you can just kind of throw them out and they'll come up. But with seed, you can't always just throw them out in the spring and expect them to come up. It's a lot more complicated than that. It can be very complicated. So to read up about that, because that's also enjoyable too.
Yeah, I'm like you guys. Don't dig it up from the wild. It's probably not going to survive. A lot of these plants have taproots, like the milkweed. If you bust that taproot, you're done. They've got mycorrhizal communities. They only live in certain soils. And if you move them out of those soils and that soil community, then that makes them more likely to die. So, you might as well just go spray the plant, basically, if you're going to dig it up a lot of times and move it. Plus, you've got to have that permission from the landowners. Even when you're collecting seeds, you need to have permission, and there's guidelines. Yeah, if you're just taking like a handful of seeds for your own use, you still need to have permission, but that's probably not going to impact the ecosystem. But if you're doing it on a larger scale, there are specific guidelines that you need to follow to make sure that you're not having those negative impacts on the larger system as a whole.
Yeah. And I think also, Margaret, don't you offer seeds too, so that, you've already got them all ready to go, and they may have instructions and stuff on your seed packets. Is that right?
That's right. So I also sell seeds. And how I do that is, rather than like going back to the natural areas every year to collect from those, I have grown up plants and put them either in like beds, of individual species for seed production, or in gardens. And so then I have a nearby ongoing source of seed. And yeah, I sell packets of those and mixes of those for people to use at home.
Yeah, that's good to know, because that's a question I get asked a lot is, do you have seeds? And no, I don't sell seeds. That's just not the route I've gone. But yeah, that's good to know that you do. It's always good to have other sources to send people to.
Thank you. It's kind of, I think the seed part is my hobby because I do it on such a small scale. We talked about brownstone seed, which has all this equipment and amazing sorting materials. And I'm there with my little sieve. I just do it in the evening. I don't think I make any money on those, but I just love working with the seeds. They're beautiful, they're shapes, and they have different scents to them. So I just like everything about seeds.
And really, this whole thing is a labor of love. Growing the plants from time you got a little bitty seed all the way up. And like Alicia was saying, you don't get to just throw these in the ground and hope they come. Well, you can throw them in the ground and hope they come up. But if you're trying to grow for a nursery, that's not going to do very well. There's all these different techniques and stuff. And I don't know about you guys, but I didn't really have an off season. It's like everybody talks, oh, it's the off season. No, it's just a different season. I've got seeds going and getting things started, because you have to do different treatments on them, and winter treatments and summer treatments on some of them. And yeah, it gets complicated very quickly. So, because I know a lot of our listeners are more the homeowners, what would you tell them if they're just getting interested in native plants? What would be some of your suggestions for somebody who's like, okay, I really, really want to start planting native plants. How do I get started?
Well, I think you could approach it in a variety of ways, depending on who it was that was coming and asking the questions. You could go anywhere from telling them to go to the Monarch Watch website to, some simple books and pamphlets, to, depending on who they are, tell them, maybe take some hikes and start getting familiar with where they are in nature and how that works. That's really, really helpful. But someone just starting out, also, I just kind of encourage them just to keep coming back to the nursery and just, looking around. You're really absorbing much more than you realize when you can kind of see them growing in, like, Margaret's bed. She was talking about things, see how tall they get and just their structure and form, and that way they can kind of understand better what would look good where in their situation, what they might like to put in a pot. Sometimes I encourage people to start little container gardens. So, if they're worried about something spreading, but the main thing I try to do is find safe things where it's going to be successful for them and suggest little things like that. But just the fact that they're interested, I think you could almost take it any direction and not go wrong.
Yeah, I know for me, I usually start with a conversation. It's like, okay, what's your site like? Because if you're planting native plants, I mean, this is the same as any gardening thing. Do you have sun? Do you have shade? Is it wet? Is it dry? Okay, how tall do you want it to get? And it really becomes almost an interview to find out just the basic information before I can even make a suggestion. There isn't a one size fits all answer here. And then it's like, okay, now what do you want the plant to do?
Their goals.
Are you interested in pollinators? And what kind of pollinators are you interested in? Is it hummingbirds? Is it butterflies? Is it bees? Is it everything? Do you want to feed the birds, the songbirds, and use it to attract the songbirds in there? So yeah, I think it's a balancing act there. And it's like recognizing that there isn't one plant to get started out with for native plants. There isn't one answer. It's always going to depend on everything else that you want and have.
No, I think it can be hard. It can be hard. And I think some people just get very overwhelmed. There's a lot to choose from, which is a good thing. But yeah, it just can be hard to choose. And I think some people just like to walk through the nursery and look at all the photographs and read everything and spend hours there and make their own choices. And that's great. But some people really do need more help. And I think you're right, Shannon. It's a conversation that you have with them to try to narrow down what conditions they have, how much work they want to put into it. And I maybe will try to start with just a few plants that fit those criteria that I think are, like Alicia said, going to give them some success to start with, not too hard to grow, and that will work for that site. And maybe just with a few things, get them started that way so they're not so overwhelmed and they can see how much they like it and build on that.
Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, definitely helping them find the plants that are going to give them the success so that they can build upon it. Because if it dies the first year, nobody's going to come back to it. I mean, I don't. And personally, I think that's kind of part of our job is to help people who are getting started figuring out how to be successful.
Yeah, what are some safe plants that you all might recommend? I can think of about 5 right off the top of my head just to get people started.
Of course, I always go for prairie dropseed.
I wonder why.
Definitely.
And I really want to convince people that these subtle grasses have this beauty to them. And I think that people do learn to love them over time. But that of course, is my favorite. But, another one that I go to a lot is the native honeysuckle vine because it's just so showy. Even people that, think they don't like native plants are going to love that. It flowers throughout the season and attracts a lot of wildlife. So that's one of my fun go-to species. What about you, Alicia?
Oh, I was thinking, purple coneflower because it's safe and everybody's kind of familiar with it, or maybe blazing star. That's another one. But I definitely think you're right that if somebody wants something, just perfect would be prairie dropseed. It checks every box. Definitely. What else? Usually people want a milkweed. So if it's a yard, I usually go with probably the swamp milkweed, or should be called rose milkweed.
I agree. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Let's see. But yeah, what else would be a typical one? Sometimes a lot of people want short things, that they don't get above maybe 2 or 3 feet. So aromatic aster is a safe one. Some rose vervain is a really short, nice kind of ground covery thing. You do want things that bloom, for a long time and are easy to grow. So there's a few of them right there that I think, people would feel like they'd see a lot of butterflies and things like that and feel like they've got a solid start. How about you, Shannon?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm with you on the purple coneflower. That's one of the ones that I usually, because it's pretty indestructible and it's pretty forgiving as to where you put it. Lanceleaf coreopsis is another one that I really like for that purpose. If they want hummingbirds, then either Eastern Columbine is one that's pretty good, and it's in that early season, right when the hummingbirds start to arrive. If they have a wetter area, then cardinal flower, but that's a little bit trickier. It tends to be a little bit shorter lived. If you let those leaves get covered up in the winter, it's going to die out. If it dries out, it's going to die out. So that's not usually one I recommend for beginners, but if they've got a little bit more experience or a little bit wetter area, that's always a perfect one. I also like, let's see, what are some of the others I really like? When it comes to asters, I really like the New England aster because it's so indestructible and it blooms starting to get into that later summer season. Any of our native sunflowers are awesome. And if they've got an area that they can just want to let go wild and have something absolutely take over, cup plant is my favorite, but it's not for a small garden area, a small space that you want to keep neat and immaculately perfect. This is the, I want it to take over the space and I don't want to have to worry about anything else plant, because it is very aggressive. But oh my gosh, I love my cup plant.
Yeah.
I love cup plant too. It's just so cute, how you get birds drinking water out of the leaves. It's just the sweetest thing.
Or the gray tree frogs in the little cups looking out.
Yeah.
Very cute.
Yes. And then during July and August, especially August, my cup plants absolutely covered up in all kinds of native bees, butterflies. There was one year I had monarchs and tiger swallowtails almost fighting over the blossoms on it. It was so amazing.
I would say along with that, have you all noticed, if I know you all say you have beds and separation of things, and I'm always learning, so I'm going to admit that right off the bat, but I always get so amazed that I'll go from one bed and it'll be covered with all these maybe, let's say 4 to 5 different pollinators, and then go to the next one and there'll be maybe some that are the same but a lot of really different ones, and then you'll go to the next one and a lot of different ones again. I'm just so fascinating to me how there's just such different, so some will have like little bitty flies and small things, and others will have, the wasps, and others will have, butterflies and bee, it's just so interesting.
This is Margaret, and I agree. I think that's one of the coolest things, and I wish I knew more of my insects. I try to learn, but there are just so many different ones to visit. It's very cool.
Yeah, and I've started to go down the rabbit hole with the different insects and trying to identify more of them instead of just going, oh, that's pretty. I'm constantly learning. I think I will be learning until the day I die. I hope I'll be learning until the day I die. I love doing that. So yeah, but yeah, different species of insects and different types of insects are attracted to different types of plants. And that's why I always encourage people to, if you're really wanting to have a pollinator garden or a wildlife garden, have these plants as part of an ecosystem instead of just showcasing the plant itself. You want to have all kinds of different things there, different shapes, different sizes, different species, different genera, different families of plants, and have several of each species so that it's not just one, because that rarely attracts a bunch of anything. But if you have several of the same type plant, and then you have several different types of plants in there, you're going to have so many different things. And just like you said, Alicia, you'll start to notice that, okay, this is the group of insects that are on this type of plant, and this is on this type of plant. And that might change throughout the day too. So if you pay attention to the times of days and what you see, you can even see differences in the types of insects that are on it at different types of day, which gets even more fascinating.
Yeah.
So my husband happens to be an organic farmer. And so we've developed native beds within his farm field, his 2-acre farm field, and really specifically designed to help attract pollinators, to bring in pollinators to his crops, but also to bring in beneficial insects that help control some of the pests that are a problem. And I think I would love to see more of that, like integrate into our farms native plants versus the use of chemicals. And actually at Kentucky State University, a professor is looking at that and growing the native plants together with corn and comparing that to corn that uses traditional pesticides. And I'm hoping that he gets some great results with that, and would love to see more of it.
What's his name?
I was trying to, it's a long name and I'll look it up, but I can't remember, but I'll get it to you because he would be an interesting person to talk to.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought this up because that's a question that I've actually gotten asked a couple of times within like the relatively recent time frame. I've been asked that question is about, do you plant native plants with the vegetables, or how close would you plant them? And one of the people that was asking me this question was actually concerned about the pollinators going to the native plants instead of to the garden vegetables. I was like, no. You want to have them reasonably close. She was like, well, how many feet? I was like, I can't tell you how many feet. I don't know that, but you want to have them reasonably close because those pollinators are going to then go to the vegetables as well. And then I like what you were bringing up too, is with the beneficial insects and those natural predators and having them come in there.
We have no data, but my husband says it's really helped.
This was going to ask you, how many years have you all been trying that?
They've been in there for probably 10 years now. And it's really cool to see like the number of, I really like the parasitoid wasps. Mm-hmm. They're a really interesting species. And we planted rattlesnake master, which is a really fun native plant. And they especially like to feed on the nectar from that. But they lay their eggs in the tobacco hornworm, which really is damaging to vegetable crops. And David said he really sees those tobacco hornworms with the eggs in them. and they'll actually kill that pest. He says that he really sees a lot of those around. So
cool.
Good news.
So if we're talking about beneficial insects and pests and parasitoid wasps, how do you deal with pests in the nursery? So talking about caterpillars and aphids and grasshoppers and flea beetles, because I don't know about you, but I get those in my nursery.
It's like a buffet for them if you have enough like milkweed and things like that. Yes. I don't know about you all, but have you all tried, I call them like decoy plants, where I might have a big bed of let's say common milkweed, and then I'll have all the babies on my swamp milkweed, and I'll just kind of relocate them to these other places where there's plenty of other food. That's how I deal with the caterpillars. But the aphids, I just use literally an old toothbrush, and I just brush them off, and it's just keeping on top of it. That's what I do. So I don't know what you all do.
This is Margaret. And I think for one thing, I think having a diversity of species helps. Mm-hmm. I think people that have just one species that they're growing, I think they tend to get hit with a lot more insects. But I do have, aphids are a problem. And I think one of my problems is I tend to overwater my plants. I have to quit that. But they're my babies, and I want them to be all happy. And I've used like diatomaceous earth to help with aphids. And just spraying water on it, or safer soap is another organic method to do that, although I try to limit the use of that as well. But I do what Alicia does too. I move my little monarch caterpillars out to my garden, my common milkweed. Although when people find a monarch caterpillar on the milkweed in the greenhouse, I think they would pay extra. That's always pretty exciting for them. But I try to limit their access to the plants in the nursery.
Yeah. And with mine being outside, the aphids, I've got the oleander aphids that get all over the milkweed, and the ones out in the fields and in the gardens and stuff, I usually just let them be. In the nursery, I take great pleasure in going squish, 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 squish all along the stem and just gently squishing them and squishing them up underneath the leaves and stuff. Because the little parasitoid wasps that come in and take care of them, they don't seem to come in and take care of them fast enough in the nursery for that, but they do over in the fields and the gardens and stuff. So I let them do that. But then with the caterpillars, I usually end up and this may be a factor because I'm much smaller scale than you guys, but I usually end up just letting them be a lot of times. I mean, if I find them early enough to move them, I will, but if they've already just kind of pretty much decimated everything, I'll just let them decimate that species and go ahead, do their own thing. And I've found that if I let them do their thing within a month or so, I mean, they're native plants. They've evolved being eaten. So within a month or so, it's back up. The plant looks like it's never been eaten before. And I've got customers who laugh and say, okay, because they'll have ordered something. I'll email them and say, okay, the caterpillars found it. I can't sell it to you right now. Give me about a month. And they're like, okay. And I'll send them pictures as it's growing back. And they always laugh because most of my customers, they know I'm growing the plants for the pollinators and for the natural ecosystem. And I say, this is proof that I'm not spraying pesticides. I'm letting the system take effect. It might have a little bit of a munched leaf, but it's not going to hurt anything. And if it's really munched, then okay, we'll wait and let it come back a bit before we actually sell it.
I had a question for you all. I bet you all have noticed with these different aphids and things that there's a real seasonality to it. And it seems to be and even the number of them seems to be affected by things I have yet to determine, like maybe the weather or whatever. But you just sit there and I brace myself waiting for the aphids to show up, and it's just like they'll kind of come and there's a big wave and then it seems to end. But they all seem to have this really interesting pattern of showing up at certain times and then they're kind of done. I just wondered if y'all had noticed that.
This is Margaret, and yes, I have, and I don't understand it either.
Yeah, I'm the same way as you, but I mean, everything's got a season to it. So it makes sense. There's always those peaks and valleys with it. And I don't know about you guys, but last year seemed to be really bad for the oleander aphids. I saw more of them even out in the fields. And my wild populations of milkweed seemed to be much oranger than normal and covered with a lot more aphids. And yeah, I'm like you. I have no idea why. It just seemed to be.
Yeah.
This is Margaret, and I don't know if I noticed. I think I always get a lot. So.
Yeah, I keep wondering if the hummingbirds are going to show up and really do their stuff on these aphids. Are they supposed to eat those little aphids or no?
I've never heard of hummingbirds eating oleander aphids. No.
Oh, shoot.
I'm not going to say they don't. I've never heard of it. That's not something I've heard of them eating. I know they do eat
maybe ladybugs or something.
Yeah, ladybugs are supposed to, and I do have some ladybugs in there, but not enough, I think.
Yeah, and then there is a little bitty parasitoid wasp. It's a pretty small one that will actually lay its eggs in the oleander aphids. And supposedly, if you look really closely at them, so you've got the bright orange ones. Those are the normal healthy ones. But when they start to look browner, the bodies, those are the ones that have the parasitoid wasps inside of them, the larvae. So those are the ones you definitely don't want to squish.
Have you all noticed also that with milkweed in particular, that particular genus, I swear I see more life on those plants, be it aphids or beetles or, when they bloom the butterflies of different kinds. I feel like they're just really popular with very many different insects of all kinds. I don't know if y'all have noticed how they seem to really be used a lot.
Yeah, this is Margaret, and I've noticed that a lot of activity on that. The other species that I found, or the genus, is the mountain mint, Pycnanthemums. They just attract everything. They're so much fun.
Oh yeah, that's another one of my favorites is the mountain mint. Oh, and that's one that if people aren't scared off by the name mint, that I also recommend for beginners because they are in the mint family, so they are kind of indestructible. But I tell people they're not going to go spearmint peppermint crazy. They will spread a little bit, but they're not going to go what everybody's afraid of mint doing.
And my favorite is the world mountain mint, which is the fragrance. It just, if you have a cold, it will clear your sinuses. It's just such a strong fragrance. I just love it.
I don't know if I've got a favorite. I like slender mountain mint and hairy mountain mint a lot, just because of the number of pollinators they get. And then I absolutely love hoary mountain mint.
Yeah, that's a fun one.
Oh, and that's one that I always tell people too, because a lot of times I get people talking about bee balm. And of course, here in Kentucky, July, you've got powdery mildew on wild bee balm. It just is. It's going to happen. That's later in the season, the more powdery mildew you're going to get on it. And it doesn't seem to affect the plant, the health of the plant, really. It just doesn't look as nice. So I tell people plant hoary mountain mint around it. And then you've got the pretty white leaves of the hoary mountain mint. And it kind of covers up and camouflages the bee balm powdery mildew. And it all just works out perfectly fine.
Good idea.
Yeah, I learned that one by just happened to have planted them next to each other. And then I noticed one year, oh, wait a minute, that works.
Speaking of the mints and stuff like that, I always find it really kind of fun. And I wonder if you all have had this experience where you might get a few people, like they'll either come in and say, I want anything that's fragrant, or maybe I want anything that's blue flower, or I want anything that's, attracts hummingbirds, of course, things like that. But just that some people are attracted to fragrance or a certain color or a certain texture or things like that. I find that really interesting because I've never really done that myself. So I just think that's kind of neat to see what people enjoy.
Yeah, I agree. It's like the different things that draw people to the native plants, right? And I do like fragrances, and so I get that one. But I also get the people with, I don't like yellow. I find that a little bit hard because there are a lot of great yellow things, but you want them to love their garden. So there are plenty of other colors for them to choose from.
Yeah, I'm like you, Margaret, I get that occasionally. And I mean, it's just part of finding out what fits for them and what connects. And I love the fact that we're all connected to different things, because life would be pretty boring and our gardens would be boring if we all like the same things. But yeah, what are some of the other questions that you guys get asked a lot? Oh, one that I get asked is, we've got a lot of deer in our neighborhood. What won't the deer eat? Do you guys get that question a lot?
Yeah, we have a lot of deer up here too, and I get that question a lot. And you have these lists of things that are deer resistant, but I tell people that when deer are hungry, they will eat pretty much everything. So I'm not going to guarantee anything, but it is a challenge. And one thing I have found is that the deer don't tend to like the grasses. They don't tend to feed on that. And I found it helps a little bit to put some of the native grasses like little blue stem and prairie dropseed along the edge of the garden to keep the deer away. But if they're hungry, yeah, it's a challenge to keep them away. I think a fence is maybe the best bet. What about you, Alicia?
I get asked a lot short things that don't get, any taller than usually like 2 feet. And then of course they want them to bloom from March to November.
Yeah. I can give you 10 plants that will do that.
Yeah, I think that's one hard thing is when they're coming, a lot of people are coming at this from being used to buying at regular garden centers where the plants are designed for those reasons, and then kind of retrofitting it with native plants, that's not why they're short and things like that. Trying to kind of integrate that, I think, is a little bit of a challenge, but I often get something that doesn't spread, not taller than 2 feet, and low maintenance. And there's often a lot of tall specific orders for just different qualities to the plant. So I often get that.
Yeah, I've run into some of those questions too about short, and then again the long bloom times, which some of them you can have those really long bloom times. I mean, Black-eyed Susan just blooms forever. But I think part of it is also realizing that, or at least what my experience has been, is that a lot of people are coming at it from the idea of, like you said, traditional garden plants, which a lot of those are annuals. And so they do have that longer bloom time a lot of times. Whereas a lot of our natives, at least the ones I grow, are perennials, which means they're going to have that shorter, more specific bloom time. So you can have more different types, which I like having that change throughout the season. And then one of the things, I love your idea, Margaret, of planting the grasses as kind of that natural fence for the deer. And like you, I've got some that, okay, these are more deer resistant than others. And then the other thing I love is that some of our perennials, because they're native, because they evolved with the pressure from the deer or from the bison going through, or from the rabbits, with the bison, short-term intense pressure, with the deer and the rabbits, probably not as short-term, but not as intense either, is that they can take some grazing pressure. So with some of our names, like New England aster that I mentioned before, a lot of times I found it'll get too tall and flop over by the end of the season. And so it still blooms and it looks beautiful, but the blooms are on the ground, not up taller. So I'll just tell people, if you're afraid it's going to flop, go through and give it some artificial deer pruning and chop it off a little bit partway through the season. And then it'll come back bushier and shorter. And because it's bushier, it's going to have more flowers on it anyway. So if they're afraid that the deer are going to eat it, sometimes I'll say, well, here's a plant the deer will eat, and it will make it bushier and give you more flowers with it as well. So there's options in that manner too, if you know, the deer are going to eat anything in my area.
That comment made me think, Shannon, this is Margaret, that one question I get asked a lot is about whether they should cut back a garden, a native garden, at the end of the season. And I really do. I try to encourage people to leave the dead stalk standing, throughout the wintertime, because there's still seeds present for birds to feed on and other critters to feed on. And the hollow stems of the plants can be a place where, native bees can overwinter. And then I typically cut them back in the very early spring or late winter. But at the same time, I think some people hate how that looks. And if you hate how it looks, you need to do what you need to do, and it won't harm them. But if you can take some of the messiness, it really is a help for a lot of critters over the winter.
Yeah, and this is Alicia, and I totally agree. And one thing I try to tell people with that in mind is, if you can get like a sign, like, National Wildlife Federation habitat, I think that can really make a big difference with how people view stuff. Like if my parents, for example, had a large dead tree in the middle of their yard and they put like that, one of those signs. And so people wouldn't think, oh, you know, if they need to get rid of that mess, they'd think, oh, this is for wildlife. And they'd kind of get on board, and, you know, just how much of a difference that makes, and just to have that little bit of information for them to look at.
That's a good idea.
That is a good idea. Those cues to care, as I've seen it referred to so often. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Margaret, about leaving the stems whenever you can in the plants, because yeah, there's so much there. And beyond just having the hollow stems for the native bees later on, but I mean, you might have chrysalises for some of our caterpillars and our butterflies on some of those stems as well. And you don't want to just be throwing those away. So yeah, I understand when people need to do it for HOA purposes or just their own aesthetic reasons and needs. So yeah, there's a balance in there. But yeah, I agree with you. Whenever possible, leave it be. Is there anything else that you guys want to mention or think we need to talk about? Because we've talked about a lot of cool stuff and good stuff here.
I just have one story I thought was cute. It's not flamboyant, but one year I was growing a whole bunch of great blue lobelia, and they were all together and they were just buzzing with all kinds of flies. And it's 100 degrees out and you're tired and sweaty. So you go in through and you're watering them. And I saw up in, not at the base of the plant in the pot, but up in the stalk was this frog, and he was kind of hiding, and he had climbed up the stalk and he was ready to get ready to, you know, fish out those insects. And it was just so much fun to see how creative this little frog was. Just little things like that I think are delightful.
Yeah, this is Margaret, and I guess I wasn't tending to my plug trays very well. And I actually found a bird's nest in the center of one of my plug trays of grasses. And it really startled me. But so I protected it. It really didn't hurt too many of the plants. I was surprised.
Yeah, I'm always amazed by all the different things I find in my nursery area and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I've had trays of water where I could put the plants in if it was too dry or stuff. And I've come back and found where I couldn't put the plants into the tray because the tray was filled with rain and then it filled with frog eggs. And I couldn't put the plants in without running the water over and losing all my frog eggs or all my tadpoles and stuff. So yeah, it's always amazing what you can find, I think, in the nursery and just the life that it brings in itself.
Right. I've been just so surprised. I mean, you'll have little wrens going in and out of places. And one year I had where I think a pair of hummingbirds moved in just because of that red honeysuckle you were talking about, Margaret. And it was so delightful. And just always discovering a new kind of chrysalis or caterpillar, even if they devastate the plants. And just, you know, finding those little critters. I think I found 3 or 4 kinds of frogs and toads. Like I found toads buried in my little pots, and, you know, walking and stepping one time on what I thought was a brick. And I'm like, there is no brick here. And it was a little box turtle. It seems like it just brings everything to life. And I mean, you really notice it. And, you know, there's a huge difference. And I think just that is just so rewarding.
I agree.
Oh, yes, I agree too. But yeah, this has been so much fun. Thank you guys for coming on here with me today. I will have links in the show notes to all of our different websites and Facebook pages if anybody wants to check out our nurseries and learn more about them or get in contact with us and ask questions. I know all 3 of us have always enjoyed talking and sharing our love of all this. So I don't mind when people email me and ask me questions. I'm assuming the same's for you guys just because of the way I know you all.
Yeah, that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes. And quick questions. Because a lot of times I am asked, do you ship plants? And I know for me, I do not. But both of you guys do, correct?
I do. This is Alicia. Yeah, that a pretty big part of my business is shipping.
And this is Margaret. I only started doing it a couple of years ago, but I do ship. And with COVID last year, that was helpful to me. So.
Okay, so if people are interested in those plants, they can get in contact with you that way if they want to ship. And Margaret, you do seeds?
Yes, I do seeds and plugs and larger pots too.
Okay. And Alicia, you do not do seeds?
Not yet, no. I mostly do just nursery quart pots and, you know, different size gallon pots for larger woody plants. I will do plugs sometimes, maybe for contract growing, but not very often.
Yeah, and I don't do seeds. I've got quart pots, 3-quart pots, and gallon pots. And then for some of my shrubby trees, I'll go up to 3 gallons occasionally. But yeah, this has been absolutely amazing and fun. So thank you guys so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Shannon. I enjoyed it too. It was
Definitely.
Okay.
Thanks, Shannon.
Yep. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
fun. You too. Bye.
I really appreciate Margaret and Alicia taking the time to talk with us today. I'm sure you could tell from our conversation that all three of us are passionate about this and really enjoy helping others learn more about growing native plants. This passion for what we do and joy in sharing our knowledge with others are common characteristics of most native plant nursery owners that I've met, which might be one of the reasons why I always think it is so much fun to talk to others who have native plant nurseries or even are just growing native plants for themselves. I always learn something new from those conversations and come away with new inspiration and a renewed passion for this endeavor. I hope you learned something new and were inspired by our conversation as well. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know that I offer live webinars almost every month. On May 20th, 2021, I will be teaching a class about some of the bee diversity found in the eastern U.S. and the different life histories of those bees. If you're listening to this after May 20th, 2021, then odds are I'll have another webinar coming up soon. You can learn more about my upcoming webinars and how to register by visiting www.shannontromboli.com/virtual classes, or just visit the webpage for this podcast episode and click on the link there. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.